Montana Territory, spring of 1876. The wind crawled low through the grasslands outside Fort Benton, carrying dust, memories, and the sharp cry of a newborn into the early morning light. Odessa Rainer held her child close, sweat drying on her brow as the midwife wiped blood from her thighs. She had no husband, no family left, and nothing but a burlap bag of clothes and $2 to her name. But she had a baby girl now, a soft, squirming miracle pressed against her chest. "She's mine," Odessa whispered, voice hoarse, eyes shining. "Her name is Hope." The room fell into a silence that was not kind. The midwife, an older woman with narrow shoulders and a mouth that never smiled, gave a short breath through her nose. "Hope," she repeated, like it was the name of a horse that had thrown its rider. "She's going to need more than hope to make it out here," one of the neighbor women muttered as she gathered a pile of linens. "She needs a father, not a name like that," another added. Odessa heard every word, but she kept her chin high and her arms firm around the baby. She had already buried her parents after the fever swept through their homestead near Miles City. She had already walked 3 days on blistered feet just to find someone who would help deliver her child. She had already lost the man who put this baby in her belly, left without a word when the snow first fell. So no one was going to tell her what to name the only thing she had left. Later that day, with Hope swaddled and sleeping in a worn feed sack she turned into a cradle, Odessa stepped out onto the porch of the boarding house she had begged her way into for a few nights. She watched the wagons roll past, men loading barrels onto carts, the distant clang of hammer to steel echoing from the blacksmith shop down the slope. She knew she had no job, no home, and no one to turn to. But she also knew she had to keep moving. 3 days later, Odessa stood outside the general store in the town of Arrow Creek, her arms aching from carrying Hope and a sack of flour she had bartered for with a pair of hand-sewn baby booties. She was about to step back onto the dirt road when a rider came through town at a slow trot, long legs stretched over a dusky bay mare, a rifle slung behind his saddle. His hat was pulled low, but she could tell his eyes were watching everything. He stopped a few feet from her, boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "You all right, miss?" Odessa hesitated. She had grown used to men asking questions with interest they did not mean, but this one had a voice like the morning after a storm, calm, no rush. "I'm fine," she said, adjusting the baby in her arms. But the sack was slipping and her arms were shaking. He stepped forward and caught the sack before it hit the ground. "Looks like you could use a hand." She stared at him. He was young, maybe 25, with a strong jaw, sun-colored hair curling around the edge of his hat, and eyes the color of wheat before harvest. He held the flour sack like it weighed nothing. "I do not need charity," she said quietly. "I did not offer any." He waited. Then added, "Name's Fletcher Nolan. I work out of a ranch a few miles east. I am heading that way now." She nodded once. "Odessa Rainer, this is my daughter." He looked down at the sleeping bundle in her arms. "What's her name?" "Hope." A pause. Then a quiet smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It suits you both." Something about the way he said it, like he meant it, made her throat tighten. She looked away. "I just need to get back to the boarding house." "I'll walk you," he said, already falling into step beside her. By the time they reached the house, Odessa's arms were trembling. She did not speak much, but Fletcher did not seem to mind the silence. He carried the sack, held the door, and left without asking for anything. The next day he returned with a basket of eggs. "You said you were looking for work," he said. "My boss's wife just had a baby. She could use help keeping up the place." Odessa hesitated. "You'd have a bed, meals, and be paid fair," he added. "Why are you doing this?" Fletcher looked at her long. "Because I know what it is to lose everything and still try to stand." She said nothing, but her lips parted as if she might. Then she looked down at Hope. "All right," she said. The Nolan Ranch sat on a wide stretch of land where the cottonwoods bent over a creek and the prairie rolled out like a quilt. Fletcher led her there the next morning himself. Odessa was quiet on the ride. Hope slept against her chest, and Fletcher rode alongside her with easy silence. When they reached the ranch house, a woman with a baby in one arm and a broom in the other stepped out onto the porch. "Well, thank the Lord," she said. "You must be Odessa." "Yes, ma'am, I am Cora, and this little tornado is Samuel. Come on in." Odessa followed her inside. The place was warm, loud with the sounds of children and chickens and boots on wood. It smelled like stew and something clean. She was shown a small room with a cot and a shelf. She set Hope down and turned around to find Fletcher leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You sure you're all right here?" he asked. She nodded. "It is more than I had yesterday," he nodded back. But as he turned to leave, Odessa said, "Thank you." He paused. "You do not owe me anything?" "I know, but thank you anyway." Their eyes held for a beat too long. Then he tipped his hat and stepped out. That night, while Odessa rocked Hope by the window, she could hear the low hum of men talking outside. Fletcher's voice was among them, steady and low. She felt something settle in her for the first time in months, not safety exactly, but something close. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. She stepped into the kitchen and found Fletcher there, sleeves rolled, pouring a mug. He looked up. "You drink it black or with sugar?" She blinked. "I black." He handed her the cup and their fingers brushed. That whole day, she found herself watching for him, not because she had to, but because for the first time in a long while she wanted to. And when she passed by him in the barn later that afternoon, her dress catching on a nail, it was Fletcher's hands that steadied her. His touch was gentle, but it lingered half a second longer than needed. Neither of them said anything. But something had shifted. Hope cried from the porch, and Odessa turned toward the sound. Fletcher looked after her, something warm in his eyes. And for the first time since her world burned down, she thought maybe she had met someone who wanted to help her build something new. Early summer brought dry heat that clung to skin and settled in the folds of dresses and the creases of hands. Odessa rose before the sun most mornings, her back aching from the cot, her arms full with a waking child. Hope was growing fast, sturdier now, louder, her eyes tracking light and motion with quiet curiosity. Cora had shown her how to boil linen on the stove, how to keep milk from souring by sinking the jar into the creek near the back field. There was work enough to keep her hands busy and her mind from going places it didn't belong. One afternoon, Odessa stood at the edge of the corral, watching Fletcher shoe a gelding. His shirt was damp with sweat, and dust coated the tops of his boots. He moved with the kind of patience she hadn't seen in many men, never shouted at the animals, never jerked a rope. There was something in the way he crouched, steadying the horse's leg, that made her chest feel like it had swallowed a stone. "You ever break a horse?" he asked without looking up. "No," she said, brushing hair from her face. "Only ever rode the ones that already knew where they were going." He straightened, wiped his forearm across his brow. "Seems to me those are the ones hardest to trust. They don't need you." "Maybe," she said. "But they don't leave you in the middle of the night either." He didn't answer right away. He set the hammer down, leaned on the fence post. "My brother did that," he said finally. "Left our ma with 4 younger ones and a patch of land so dry you could light it with a match." Odessa blinked against the light, the wind lifting dust between them. "Where'd he go?" "South, I think. Never wrote, might be dead, might not be." "I'm sorry." Fletcher shook his head. "I'm not telling it for pity. Just don't want you thinking you're the only one who's had someone walk off." She nodded once, then turned toward the house. Hope would be waking soon, and the heat made her fussy. That evening, Odessa sat on the back step, Hope in her lap, the smell of cooked beans still lingering in her apron. Fletcher approached with 2 tin mugs, one extended toward her. "Cooled coffee," he said. "Not much, but it's something." She took it, their fingers brushing again. This time she didn't draw away so quick. "Cora says you were up half the night with Hope," he said, settling beside her. "She's got colic," Odessa said. "Won't sleep unless I walk her." "I used to walk my baby sister up and down the hallway till my legs gave out," he said. "She'd scream like the devil was inside her, calmed only when I sang." She looked at him sideways. "You sing?" He took a sip, looked toward the horizon, not well, but loud enough to drown her out. Odessa laughed before she meant to. The sound surprised her. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" he asked after a beat. "I did once," she said. "Back when I thought there was another life waiting somewhere else. Now I think this is it." Fletcher nodded slowly. "It's not a bad place to dig in. If you've got something worth staying for." Hope stirred, pressing her cheek into Odessa's chest. The sky was softening, the first stars beginning to show. "I don't know what I have yet," she said, "but it's more than I had before." Fletcher leaned back on his hands, his shoulder brushing hers. "They don't talk much about folks who stay," he said, "but they're the ones who make things last." She looked down at the baby, then at the man beside her. "I want something that lasts," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. That night, after Odessa laid Hope down in the cradle Fletcher had helped her mend with cedar shims, she found herself pressing her palm to the windowpane, watching a lantern flicker in the barn. She didn't know what was building between them, but she knew it wasn't fleeting. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to go wrong. She felt like she was waiting for something to begin. The days stretched longer as June deepened, sun hanging high until the shadows grew thin and the fields baked under its weight. Odessa had taken to wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat Cora lent her, the ribbon frayed but the shade welcome. She spent most mornings helping with laundry beside the creek, her skirts wet to the knee, Hope nestled in a wooden crate lined with horse blankets nearby. Cora's two older girls played at the edge of the shallows, their bare feet kicking up water while Odessa scrubbed shirts until her knuckles reddened. The rhythm of it soothed her, the scrape of lye soap, the slap of wet cloth, the hush of the current. Hope watched the world with her mother's quiet eyes. "You've a strong back," Cora said one morning, wringing out a towel. "Fletcher said you kept a homestead on your own a while." Odessa glanced over. "Just the winter, wasn't much left standing by spring." Cora nodded, folding the towel. "Still, plenty would have gone east." "I thought about it," Odessa said, "but I couldn't picture her growing up with factory smoke and cobblestones." "She's better for it," Cora said, "and so are you." That afternoon, Odessa found Fletcher near the west fence line, bending over a split post. She stepped through the grass, Hope snug against her hip, one hand shading her eyes. "You need another pair of hands?" she asked. Fletcher looked up, brushing dust from his palms. "Only if they're steady." Odessa knelt beside him, passing Hope into the basket she'd brought lined with a quilt square Fletcher had left on her porch the night before. He didn't mention it, and neither did she. He held the post while she hammered in the brace. Her swing was clean, unhurried. He watched her hands. "You ever think about what you want next?" he asked after a while. She paused, eyes on the grain of the wood. "I used to think I wanted a place of my own, land, a well, maybe a milk cow if I was real lucky. And now," she rested the hammer on her knee, "now I think I want someone to share it with, not out of need, just because it'd be good to have someone who stays." Fletcher didn't speak right away. He tightened the wire, then stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I ain't a man who talks much," he said. "But I don't walk away from what matters." Odessa met his gaze, steady. "I know." That night, a storm rolled in from the northwest, low thunder grumbling like a tired old man. Odessa stood by the window, rocking Hope against her shoulder. The lantern cast their shadows long and soft across the floor. A knock came, low and careful. She opened the door to find Fletcher holding a folded oilskin, rain already on his shoulders. "Cora said the roof in your room leaks," he said. Odessa stepped aside. "It does." He laid the oilskin over the cradle, careful not to wake the child. She watched the way his hands moved, deliberate and quiet. "You could have just left it," she said. His voice was low. "Didn't want to." She looked at him then, at the way the lamplight caught the curve of his jaw and the gold in his hair. He looked like the kind of man you could build a life beside, a little weathered, a little quiet, but rooted deep. "Fletcher." He turned toward her. She stepped closer, not rushed, and reached up to brush a drop of rain from his cheek. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "But I want to try." She nodded, the breath catching in her throat. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the hurried fumbling she remembered from the past. It was slow, sure, like drawing water from a deep well. His hand rested lightly at her waist, the other cupping the back of her neck. When they parted, she didn't step back. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper. Inside, Odessa leaned into the warmth of him, and for the first time since her world had cracked open, she felt it begin to mend. By mid-July, the cottonwoods around the Nolan ranch rattled dry in the breeze, their leaves dulled to a tired green under the relentless sun. Odessa had taken to keeping a damp kerchief around her neck when she worked outdoors, and Fletcher showed her how to press salt into her water to keep her strength from slipping in the heat. The bond between them had deepened without ceremony. It wasn't in declarations, but in the quiet ways they moved around each other, how she handed him the coffee pot before he asked, how he adjusted the cradle's position each morning so Hope wouldn't catch the glare from the eastern window. One afternoon, after the cattle had been driven in from the back pasture, Fletcher found Odessa in the garden pulling weeds from between rows of sprouting beans. Hope lay shaded nearby, chewing on a strip of muslin Odessa had soaked in cooled chamomile tea. Fletcher leaned against the fence, arms resting on the top rail. "I asked Cora if she'd mind watching Hope tomorrow," he said. Odessa glanced up, dirt under her fingernails, a faint line of sweat at her temple. "Why? There's a place I'd like to take you." "Just for the afternoon." She brushed her palms together, her expression unreadable. "Where?" He tilted his head toward the hills beyond the creek. "There's a spring up that way. Cattle don't graze there, it's quiet." Figured it might be good to be off the ranch a while. Odessa looked toward the baby, then back at him. "She's never been apart from me longer than an hour. Cora's raised 5. She'll mind her like her own." Odessa stood slowly, brushing dust off her skirt. "All right. If it's not too far, won't be more than 1.5 miles. I'll bring the wagon. You won't have to walk." The next morning, Odessa dressed simply in blue calico and pulled her hair back tight to her nape. Fletcher was already waiting by the gate, reins in hand, his shirt clean but collarless, the sleeves rolled to the elbow. She passed Hope to Cora with a lingering glance and climbed into the wagon without a word. They rode in companionable silence, the road narrowing into a trail as cottonwoods gave way to low scrub and wild rose. Fletcher stopped the wagon near a cluster of stones, the spring bubbling clear through a hollow in the earth. He helped her down, then unrolled a wool blanket across a patch of shade. Odessa sat, legs tucked beneath her, watching the way the breeze played over the water's surface. Fletcher offered her a tin with slices of cornbread and dried apple. "You always plan this careful?" she asked, taking the tin. "Only when it matters." She studied him then, her eyes tracing the line of his jaw, the small crease at the edge of his mouth. "Why me?" He looked away for a moment, then back. "Because you don't ask for anything, but you still give what you've got. Because you don't flinch when things get hard. Because when you look at Hope, it's like you're still daring this world to be kind." She didn't speak. The spring gurgled softly behind them. He shifted closer, slow, careful. "And because since the first time I saw you, I haven't wanted to look away." Her eyes dropped to his hand resting near hers. She placed her fingers over it, not tentative, but sure. "I didn't come here to start over," she said. "I just wanted to survive. And now, I want more than survival." He leaned in then, lips brushing hers with the same quiet certainty he used to calm a skittish mare. She kissed him back, and the world seemed to dim around them, the heat folding into something softer. When they pulled apart, Odessa rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about building something of your own?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "But I'd rather build it with someone who's already proven she can outlast a winter with nothing but grit and a baby on her hip." She smiled faintly. "You think you're ready for a woman who doesn't bend easy?" He looked down at her. "I'm counting on it." Later, as they rode back toward the ranch, the sun low behind them, Odessa watched the land stretch out in gold and shadow and thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, not just to a place, but to a person. To be seen, not as a burden or a charity case, but as someone worth choosing. Hope was asleep in Cora's arms when they returned. Odessa took her gently, pressing her lips to the baby's soft hair. As Fletcher turned to leave, Odessa touched his arm. "You can stay for supper." His hand brushed hers. "I'd like that." And for the first time since she'd stood in that stranger's kitchen with a newborn in her arms and a name on her tongue the others had laughed at, Odessa no longer felt alone in her choosing. She had named her daughter Hope because it was all she had left. Now it was something she could share. The air shifted in late August, softer somehow, like the land itself was easing its breath after the long burn of summer. Odessa stood beside the smokehouse, tying a bundle of rosemary with twine. Fletcher had asked her earlier that morning if she'd help salt down a haunch of venison he'd brought in from his last trip to the northern ridge, and she'd nodded without needing to speak. They worked in tandem beneath the eaves, he at the table with the meat, she sorting herbs and wiping down the stoneware crocks. The quiet between them had grown companionable, not careful like it once was. The kind of quiet that held space without pressing. "You ever think you'd end up here?" Fletcher asked, his hands stained dark from the salt and blood. She didn't look up from her work. "No, I thought I'd be buried under cottonwood roots outside Miles City before I saw another harvest." He nodded, pushing his sleeves higher. "I used to think I'd drift forever, pick up odd work, never put anything down long enough to keep it." Odessa tied off the last bundle. "What changed?" He looked at her straight on. "You did." She held his gaze, then set the bundle aside and stepped closer. The scent of rosemary clung to her fingers. "I don't know how to be someone's wife. I'm not asking for a wife who sews lace and waits by the window," he said. "I'm asking for the woman who dragged herself through frost and scrub with a baby on her chest and still looked the world in the eye." A long breath left her chest. "I'd want something of our own. I've been saving," he said, "for a parcel of land up near the river bend east of here. It's got water, some timber, enough flat ground for a garden and a milk cow if we're lucky." Her throat tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron. "You've been planning this." He stepped close, voice low. "I've been hoping." That evening, Odessa watched Hope sleep in the cradle Fletcher had carved a new leg for. The baby's breath came steady, her hand curled around a scrap of muslin. Through the open window, the scent of sage drifted in on the wind. She stepped outside where Fletcher stood near the barn, lantern light glinting off the curve of his cheek. She didn't speak, just walked up to him, placed her hand in his. "We'll go look at that land tomorrow," she said. He brought her hand to his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. "We'll make it ours." They wed under the cottonwood near the Nolan well, the one place on the ranch where the breeze always carried cool. Cora stitched Odessa's dress from an old bolt of cream calico, and Fletcher wore clean trousers and a vest that didn't quite match. The preacher from Arrow Creek rode out and spoke plain and kind, his words carried on the hush of gathered neighbors. Hope clapped her hands from Cora's lap when Fletcher kissed her mother. Odessa laughed, tears slipping unbidden down her cheeks. She hadn't cried at her parents' graves. She hadn't cried when the man who left her never came back. But she cried then, because something solid had finally been laid down beneath her feet. They moved to the River Bend land a week later. Fletcher built the cabin frame with two other ranch hands who owed him favors, and Odessa helped notch the beams, her hands calloused from years of work that had never before built something for herself. They planted potatoes in the back plot, and Odessa laid a row of marigolds beside the steps, her fingers deep in the warm earth. By the first frost, the cabin had a roof, a hearth, and a door that creaked but held firm against the wind. Fletcher fashioned a table from split pine, and Odessa made curtains from rough linen she traded eggs for in town. Hope took her first steps between the hearth and the doorframe, her arms outstretched, laughter bubbling from her mouth like a spring. That night, as smoke curled from their chimney and coyotes called from the distant hills, Odessa settled beside Fletcher in their bed. His arm came around her waist, and she tucked herself against him, her back to his chest, his breath warm at the curve of her neck. "You ever think," she whispered, "that we'd end up here, not just alive but here like this?" He kissed the back of her shoulder, slow and certain. "I didn't think I deserved it, but I hoped you'd prove me wrong." She smiled, eyes closing. "We made it." "We're just starting," he said. And they did. Through hard winters and early springs, through lean seasons and rich ones, they built a life marked not by ease but by steadiness. Fletcher mended fences and raised cattle. Odessa churned butter and trapped rabbits when meat ran low. Hope grew tall, learned to read by lamplight at her mother's knee, and rode horses bareback across the prairie with her father at her side. They laughed often and argued sometimes, but never once did Fletcher raise his voice, and never once did Odessa question that he would stay. Years later, when neighbors spoke of them, they spoke of a couple who built something from the ashes of what came before, who stood shoulder to shoulder not just in love, but in work, in loss, in joy. And every spring, Odessa planted marigolds by the door, yellow as morning light. Fletcher would pause on the porch with his coffee, watching her kneel in the dirt, and think not of the days he'd once wandered, but only of the good ground beneath him now. Together they stayed. Together they made something that lasted.